Welcome. I'm Scott Hodge, President of the Tax Foundation, and thank you for joining me for another of my discussions with a Tax Foundation expert on the latest trends in tax policy. During my last conversation, I spoke with Carl Smith about the long-term tax policies that Washington should implement to help the economy recover from the COVID crisis. And in an earlier conversation, we featured a conversation with Jared Walzak on how US states are responding to the COVID 19 crisis and what they can do to help their states recover. Well, today we're going to shift from the domestic policy to international policy, specifically the tax policy affecting digital services and the digital economy. And our discussion today will be with Daniel Bunn, our Vice President for Global Projects. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there saying international tax policy. What does that have to do to me and why with me and why should I care? And let me say to you that if you've ever purchased something online or ordered a ride share or used a social media platform or even made an airline reservation, then the digital tax policies that are being debated in far-off places like Paris or Brussels could alter your relationship with these platforms in a very, very significant way. And they can also impact US companies in a very significant way. And believe it or not, could also potentially impact the US Treasury by robbing the US tax base of revenues that the US government was counting on. And that could mean higher taxes for you and me if we have to make up the difference. So the stakes are pretty high here for the United States. Daniel heads up our team of economists who analyze the impact of these global tax trends and work to make sure that they're consistent with economically sound tax policy. Well, Daniel, let's get right into it and perhaps start with a few basics. I think before getting into the guts of digital taxation, from what I understand, that there have been certain rules that have guided international tax policy for the last 100 years and how multinational companies are taxed. But what we're going to see, what we're going to talk about, I think, is these digital policies will greatly disrupt those rules. So perhaps you could talk through some of the age-old principles that have guided how, when, and where the profits of multinationals should be taxed in the current environment.
I think that's a good place to start. So many companies that have headquarters in one jurisdiction, say the US, and subsidiaries in other countries around the world get taxed under a set of rules that pays attention to where their operations are and where they have physical presence. So if a US company has a factory in France, it would get taxed on the profits connected to that factory in France. Now, the rules for determining where profits should be taxed are certainly complex, but they generally connect to to places where a business has a permanent establishment with operations, employees, and contracts. So the headquarters would get taxed in the US based on profits attributable to the headquarters, and then the factory would get taxed in France with profits attributable to that that factory.
So what's changed now with the digital economy and I guess the business models of digital companies and how has that affected these rules and what is it that these international bodies see as the problem to be solved?
So the biggest change over the last several decades has certainly been the digitalization of the economy. So as I mentioned in the past, businesses really had to rely on physical operations in other countries, and that was to reach their customers, to reach new markets. But with the rise of the internet, innovations in software and cloud computing, a company in the US could reach customers around the world anywhere there's an internet connection. And this has been substantial growth and online transactions. In 2018, global e-commerce reached $26 trillion. And the vast majority of that was driven by businesses selling digital products and services to other businesses. Now, some countries look at this and ask why they can't tax tech companies as if they had a physical presence when there are a lot of transactions or engagements with their citizens. The logic basically goes like this. If a US-based internet marketplace has a lot of users and customers in France, Why can't France tax that marketplace as if it was a physical retail store in France? Now, this sort of logic has given rise to a lot of different approaches to taxing digital businesses that do not have local operations in a country. Now, these policies include applying consumption or value-added taxes to digital products. They include digital services taxes, changes to corporate income tax laws, and other policies. Now, the problem is that these new policies often contradict with the old rules that are still in operation, and they cause digital companies to be caught between the old rules and these emerging digital tax policies. This forces businesses into the position of having to pay tax twice or more on the same income. So countries are looking for an international solution to digital taxation to avoid the sort of chaos that can ensue from each country adopting its own approach.
Well, speaking of chaos, there are a lot of players in this debate. I mentioned the OECD. I think earlier the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're in Paris. It's a multilateral organization, and they're trying to find a solution to this. You have the European Union, which is playing a big role in this as well, and then individual countries. And perhaps you could just sort of, well, one, help us unpack who are all the players, and bring us up to date on what each of them are doing. You know, where is the OECD in its process, and what's it considering? What about the European Commission? And then what about all these individual countries that are kind of doing their own thing and trying to implement their own policies?
So let's start with the European Commission, which is one of the governing bodies of the European Union. In 2018, the European Commission proposed a digital services tax of 3% on the revenues of large digital companies. The proposal targeted digital advertising, online marketplaces, and sales of user data. So it was really carving out a certain portion of the digital economy for taxation. And that proposal was debated all throughout 2018 at the EU level, but was never adopted. Several EU countries were frustrated by the lack of progress on that proposal. So in 2019, France and some other countries set out to establish their own digital services taxes. And
Oh,
just recently, the European Commission renewed its commitment to a digital services tax, although it's unclear whether the policy proposal for 2020 will be the same as what we saw in 2018. Now, you mentioned the OECD, this group of 36 developed countries. They have been working on a negotiation, a multilateral negotiation on digital taxation, not just among those 36 member countries, but among more than 130 members of its inclusive framework. The OECD is focused on changing tax rules to allow countries to tax the income of digital companies where their customers are, even if there is no local physical presence, no local operations. Now, the OECD proposals have other features as well, but the most controversial piece is what is called Amount A, because it presents a challenge of splitting up the pie. If there's a US tech company with all of its operations in the US that only pays income tax to the US Treasury, and then a proposal requires that business to pay taxes in countries where its consumers are located, that would automatically change where that company is paying taxes and impact the US Treasury. Now, there will be a tug and pull on this proposal to see where the opportunities are for splitting up the pie in different ways, and whether it's a large magnitude of a shift or a smaller magnitude. And those negotiations are still ongoing. So the extent to which it would impact US revenues is still somewhat unclear, but the rules would certainly change where digital businesses pay taxes.
Uh, and then you've got these state by state or country by country
Yes.
proposals as well. And where does that play into to all of this?
So the individual country policies, so France, as I mentioned, pursued digital services tax, and then you have several other countries that are doing the same thing. Several in Europe, several around the world. You have India, Indonesia, pursuing similar policies, Brazil, and these are digital services taxes, and they're a relatively new tax tool that you can see as a kind of end run around normal tax tools like consumption taxes or income taxes. One of the problems with these, and it's kind of just in the name, is that they narrowly target digital companies. Tax
Mm.
policies generally should be neutral to the type of business a company is in. So, on a principled basis, digital services taxes violate that neutrality at the start. Digital services taxes also tax gross revenues rather than income. And that means that if you have a low profit margin, your effective tax rate would be higher than for a company that has a higher profit margin. It works similar to a tariff. So when designing digital tax policies, individual countries need to think about whether existing tax tools like consumption and income taxes can be adjusted before creating unique policies like digital services taxes. Now, lots of countries are adjusting their value added taxes to include digital goods and services. And that consumption tax based expansion can be a good thing. Countries just need to be careful about the associated compliance costs because these companies would be paying taxes to countries where they don't have operations and don't have a relationship with the government. The income tax rules, corporate income tax rules, can also be adjusted, and some countries are experimenting with ways to tax foreign businesses that have a local significant economic presence through digital platforms within their jurisdiction. So, if, for instance, you have a company that has a dedicated website for targeting customers in a country and using local currency and local language marketing, then perhaps there's some justification for charging income tax. The challenge, though, is the conflict between those new rules and the old rules. And that's really why it's critical for these policies to be negotiated in a multilateral setting like at the OECD. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that what the OECD is working on is great policy. It's still a really complex proposal, what they're working through. And I hope that countries are able to work out something that is more principled in nature rather than just a set of rules targeted at certain industries with automated digital services included in that target.
I want to turn to uh, something that the Trump administration put forward this week. But let me, if I could get back to a quick question about the OECD's proposals. They recently released some economic analysis showing the potential increase in corporate taxation around the world and the potential impact of that. And perhaps you could address that before we go over to what the Trump trade investigation is all about.
Sure. The OECD is working on an impact assessment based on these proposals that they're working on. And the proposals, as I mentioned, one is a redefining who gets to tax digital companies. And then there's a whole nother part about global minimum taxation. The OECD is still looking at the details of the policies. And until the proposals are closer to being finalized, I don't know if we'll have really good numbers. But the initial analysis, based on some assumptions about the negotiations, would show that the policies would lead to $100 billion tax increase.
Oh.
Now, the question is, with that analysis, is what does that data reflect? One of the things it reflects is that the analysis relies on data from 2016, which was before U.S. tax reform and before a lot of other changes to international taxation. So I'm not sure if that number is going to be the final number or if they're going to be able to update their analysis with more recent information. But one of the things that we'd like to see is more of this country by country analysis of which countries are going to be gainers and which countries will be losers, and the way the economics of these proposals would change the corporate behavior. Is it going to impact investment? Is it going to impact supply chain? Is it going to change cross-border trade and investment flows and things like that that are really critical to global growth? I think the OECD is working on an update to that analysis, which could be done by the end of the summer. But it will require countries at the OECD being willing to have that information published.
Well, and of course, the fear is that the United States will be a loser in that because we have so much of the world's digital companies and intellectual property and innovation. So that's certainly a concern. And on that point, the Trump administration this week, this is very timely, announced what they call a 301 investigation about the impact of digital services taxes in these other countries and their potential impact on U.S. Companies. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more for those of us who don't follow trade policy. What is a 301 investigation and why does it matter?
So the 301 investigation basically is a precursor to tariff threats. That's the easiest way to understand it. I mentioned earlier that in 2019, France and a few other countries decided to set up their own digital services taxes, and that those taxes themselves operate like tariffs. So after France adopted its digital services tax last summer, the US opened a 301 investigation into that digital services tax policy. And in December, it released a report saying that that tax discriminated against US companies. The US then threatened France with tariffs of up to 100% on some French exports. That resulted in France saying that it would not collect the tax in 2020. The liability for the tax would still accrue in 2020, but tax bills wouldn't be due until 2021. France was basically saying, let's see if the OECD can work out a solution by the end of 2020 and give some space to allow that negotiation to continue instead of seeing those tariffs come into place. The announcement this week from the US Trade Representative shows that the Trump administration is looking into the digital services taxes in 9 other countries and the European Union proposal. Now, not all of these policies have been adopted or implemented, so it's unclear whether the US Trade Representative plans to retaliate against taxes that aren't yet in force. Now, some of them are in force, like in Italy, and a recent change to the law in India. But for the most part, there's a lot of questions about how you retaliate against these things that are still in the proposal stage or still haven't been finalized into law. The US clearly wants these countries to drop their digital tax policies. And if that doesn't happen, we could be in for another round of the trade war.
Well, let's close on the consequences, as you mentioned. I'm always reminded of my favorite line from the movie Apollo 13: "Failure is not an option." And I'm sure that the OECD and those negotiators are feeling that pressure now, where the failure isn't an option to come up with a multilateral or global solution to this. So perhaps you could just close with, what are some of the risks that we're facing here, risks of these unilateral measures, and how does that fit into especially the global or the current economic context of a weakened global economy because of the COVID-19 shutdown?
Yeah, that's a huge risk. The risk is that more countries will adopt policies that discriminate against digital companies, and that those policies would work like trade barriers to cross-border digital trade. And then, if the U.S. goes through on its threats for retaliation, then you would have a tax and trade war that would ensue. As you were hinting at, it's been a very bad year for the global economy with the COVID-19 health crisis. And a tax and trade war would not be helpful to any sort of economic recovery. In fact, to do the opposite, it would make that recovery slower and longer, and potentially worsen this recession scenario that we're in now. However, instead of erecting new barriers to trade in response to harmful tax policy, the U.S. and other countries should focus on policies that promote long-term growth, like we've talked about in previous conversations. During the ongoing economic crisis, countries should be willing to work together to avoid new conflicts that could hinder an economic recovery, and instead focus on that question of how do you get through the recovery and how can tax policy support a recovery.
That's great advice because obviously economic growth um, uh, covers up a lot of sins and is really the solution to so many of these issues that are facing not only the US, but the global economy. And thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for your expertise and insights. I'm sure we're going to be revisiting this issue as we move into the summer and later in the fall as these debates continue at the international level. So thank you again. And thank you for joining us today at home, if you will, if you're at home. And I do want to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Tax Foundation's research and information at taxfoundation.org. And please, if you're interested in regular updates, sign up for our subscription service at taxfoundation.org/subscribe. And thanks again. I'm Scott Hodge, president of the Tax Foundation. Look forward to seeing you again as we talk to another of our experts on the trends in tax policy. Thanks and goodbye.